Hi everybody, I'm Bill Whittle and this is Afterburner. Well, as they slowly made their way across the floor of the Silver Legacy Resort and Casino in Reno, Nevada, they were just two old men, two very, very old men. They moved slowly and people waited patiently behind them with that same look of vague impatience so many of us seem to show old people these days. Nothing rude or pushy really, just sort of an unfocused annoyance at the inconvenience that these two old men were causing to people who had places to go and money to spend. But once they entered the small ballroom, all of that changed. You know, I've seen this kind of reaction before with celebrities. An electric current runs through the room. It's kind of, hey, he's here. No, don't look. That's him right there. And so these two old men made their way, actually they were pushed and helped and carried by friends and relatives, past the ice sculpture of a twin-engine propeller airplane, and then right next to the front tables, right beside the big cake. And these two old men are named Dick Cole and David Thatcher. Staff Sergeant David J. Thatcher was there to help celebrate Colonel Richard Cole's 100th birthday. Now, these two old men had gone on a little adventure together, you see. A little adventure 73 years before, when they were not old men at all, but rather two very young men instead. Dick and Dave and 77 other young men followed a middle-aged guy. Dick Cole didn't so much follow him as sit just a few inches to his right, and that guy was named Jimmy Doolittle, as they flew 16 B-25 Mitchell medium bombers off of the deck of the USS Hornet on the morning of April 18, 1942. It was a little more than 4 months after the raid on Pearl Harbor, and they were a little more than 600 nautical miles away from mainland Japan. Now, with half the usable takeoff distance actually behind them, occupied by the other 15 B-25s that had been hoisted onto the deck of the Hornet since the bombers were far too big to land on a carrier, Jimmy Doolittle and Dick Cole pushed the throttles forward and led the other 78 men, none of whom had ever made a carrier takeoff before, into the air, and where, in groups of twos and fours and then alone right on the deck, each one headed for their target, which was the Imperial Japanese capital of Tokyo. Now, they were 10 hours earlier and 200 statute miles further away than planned. Hornet and her escorts having been spotted by a Japanese trawler and the strike force's position radioed to the far superior Imperial Japanese Navy. So Doolittle and Hornet skipper Mark Mitchell had a quick huddle and decided to launch immediately. The extremely hazardous, top-secret mission that each one of these young men had volunteered for now became essentially a suicide mission. There was virtually no chance that these planes, launched this much further from their intended target, would be able to make their landing sites in China. But Jimmy Doolittle and Dick Cole and David Thatcher and the 77 others did not come all that way to turn around and go home. You know, I've heard anecdotally that backup crew members, those who were spared the suicide mission, actually offered incredible cash bribes to their buddies in order to get onto the planes that now certainly would have to ditch in the South China Sea. You know, the Japanese word kamikaze actually means divine wind. It was a reference to storms that had twice dispersed Mongol invasions of Japan by Kublai Khan in the late 1200s. But there was a kamikaze, a divine wind blowing on that April 18th as well, although, as it turned out, not for the doomed Japanese, not this time. An unexpected tailwind of about 30 miles per hour had, over 5 hours, given almost all of the aircraft just enough of a push for them to either ditch or bail out, not in the sea, but rather over the Chinese mainland, where, helped by Chinese civilians who would later pay a terrible price at the hands of the furious Japanese, most of the flyers were smuggled to safety and eventually returned home. One crew of 5 flyers landed in the Soviet Union, which had a non-aggression treaty with Japan at the time, and it took them about a year of internment before they came home. But 2 crews, Hallmarks and Pharaohs, fared much worse. 2 young men, Staff Sergeant William J. Dieter and Sergeant Donald E. Fitzmaurice, never got a chance to become old men. They drowned after ditching in the sea. The other 8 were captured by the Japanese. Now, of these, Lieutenant Dean Hallmark, pilot, Lieutenant William Farrow, pilot, and Corporal Harold Spatz, a gunner, were tried by the same Imperial Japanese that had murdered more than 2,500 other young men on a peaceful December morning in Hawaii a few months before. The Japanese then took Dean, Bill, and Harry to Public Cemetery No. 1 and executed them by firing squad. The others remained prisoners of the Japanese, held under a starvation diet that eventually killed Robert J. Meader. The remaining raiders were liberated by American troops in August of 1945. Many of them joined their fellow heroes and had a chance to become old men. Now, the oldest at the time of the raid, Jimmy Doolittle himself, feared that he was going to be court-martialed since he'd lost every single aircraft in his command. Instead, he was promoted 2 grades to brigadier general and was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. He died in 1996 at the age of 93. Now, virtually all historians agree that the Doolittle raid, while an enormous morale boost for a battered and defeated America and a shock to the undefeated and many believed invincible Imperial Japanese Army and Navy, did no real physical damage to Japan, that the actual damage done by the raid was minor and quickly repaired. I disagree. I believe that history shows that the Doolittle raid broke the back of the Japanese fleet and won the war in the Pacific in about 10 minutes. Now, that all happened at Midway, of course. A mere 2 months later, when U.S. dive and torpedo bombers from 3 American carriers mortally wounded 3 Japanese flat tops in 6 minutes, and a 4th one by the end of the day. That was, without question, the turning point in the war for the Pacific. But the entire Japanese thrust toward Midway Island and the desperate gamble to destroy the American fleet came as a direct result of the shock and especially the shame of having the Emperor's capital bombed by 80 Americans who took off on what seemed to be a suicide mission a few months before. And there, in a room at the Silver Legacy in Reno, Nevada, sat David Thatcher and Richard Cole, who had just seen his 100th birthday. Only 2 old men left now at what will certainly have been the last reunion of the Doolittle Raiders. And I was there. I got to shake both of their hands and thank them for what they did for me 17 years before I was born. It's not fair to say that these 2 old men and their fellow flyers were ignored by the America that they'd helped to save. They'd been honored and banqueted for most of their lives at the reunions, of which this was their last. But it is fair to say that not 1 in 100 young people, or really anybody out on the floor of that casino that day, have the slightest idea of who these 2 old men are and what they did. Because if they had been taught these things as I'd been taught them, then they too would have pressed forward to shake their hands and have their pictures taken with the kind of people worthy of this immortal kind of celebrity. You know, in a world of perpetual self-aggrandizement and 15 minutes of fame, the 24-karat nature of these men was revealed in the fire assay that they endured. When I thanked David Thatcher for everything he did for our country, he just winked at me and said, "Hey, it wasn't my fault. Blame the old man." It's never about them, of course, these golden members of the golden generation of men and women who saved the world entire. And if you know one of them and have anything you'd like to say to them, you should say it soon. You probably should say it now.